I want to talk to you about the Electoral college business in America. Now, this is important because it sort of links in with the House of Lords. So, again, I said in my previous video that what happens in Britain starts to leak over to America and vice versa. The Labour Party played ducks and drakes with the British Constitution, and they castrated the House of Lords. Now, there are many arguments against the House of Lords, but it did have a very similar effect in many ways to the sort of effect that was worked out in the American Constitution for the Electoral College. And I know that sounds funny, but just hear me out for a minute. You see, the Electoral College worked in this way. When the Constitution was developed, they decided on a one-man, one-vote system. By the way, no women in there, although I think the wife of one of the people who was constructing the American Constitution said women should be given the vote, but he took no notice of her. So anyway, it was going to be what's called popular vote. But then a lot of people who lived in who represented the more sparsely populated agricultural states saw that this was going to cause an imbalance in voting patterns, that the people who lived in the big cities at either end, basically, either end of the country, would call the shots because they'd have the people in the farmland areas would necessarily have fewer votes. So they came up with the idea of a balancing electoral college. And that's, in my opinion, a reasonable thing. Now, in Britain, we had a similar odd sort of balance in the House of Lords, as it used to be, because the House of Lords used to contain a lot of hereditary lords and some people who were commoners who'd been elevated to the House of Lords by virtue of one speciality or another. For instance, judges. They went to the House of Lords, representatives of various religions, and just people who had done very well in business or charity work or something like that. And because there was this sort of mix and much of it non-political, they were there to give a second look at the enthusiasm of the bills going through the House of Commons. The law lords would look at the legal thing, the retired professors and the religious leaders would look at the philosophical implications of various things. And the hereditary lords, many of them were landlords, of very extensive landlords. In other words, they were farmers. And they would look at the legal implications of what the passage of laws would do going through the countryside, to the countryside. So this did provide a sort of balance. It wasn't quite as, well, obviously not as democratic as the Electoral College idea, but it did provide a sort of balance. Tony Blair found this inconvenient, and he and his cronies decided to wreck the House of Lords. They decided that they were going to put political appointees in there, and they didn't completely boot out every hereditary lord, but most of them. And then they put in something that they call the Supreme Court, which took away some of the work from the law lords who were already in the House of Lords. And that's sort of like I don't know what, bolting a second wheel onto the front wheel of a bicycle. Absolutely superfluous and completely at odds with the British political system. And that was because Tony Blair found democracy inconvenient. And this is what's happening with, and he did it, and he got away with it. And I think the Democrats in America saw this and they learnt from it. And they are going to try and get rid of the Electoral College in America. And when they do, you are going to get bad laws passing. Because you've got people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who have been elected into office by people who've put that squeaky-voiced sophomore into place simply because she makes much of her Latino heritage. She says things like, well, it's more important feels than reals. And that's not true. Feels is important, but when you're making laws, you have to look down the line at the implications. And a lot of ordinary people who aren't involved in politics don't think that way, and why should they? But the people they elect to be politicians have to be more careful. And I'd advise you in America to be very careful of the attitude the Democrats have to democracy right now, because it happened here in Britain and it's a mess. It's ruined a lot of British institutions that were perfectly good, balanced as they were, with the way they developed over the centuries. So, yeah, this is a warning from somebody who's been here, done that, and seen the disastrous results. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.